The office was buzzing, but not with the usual hum of printers or low chatter. Today, it was electric taut with competition, jealousy, and unspoken rivalries. Every corner of the sleek, glass-walled floor felt charged, as if the air itself knew something monumental was about to happen. Michael felt it most acutely, not because he wanted the promotion desperately, though it would change his life. No, he wanted it because he had seen the cracks no one else noticed. The hidden moves, the silent mistakes, the unspoken truths that everyone else ignored. Across the room, his rival, Darren, the office golden boy, laughed a little too loudly at his boss's joke, flashing that perfect smile that had won awards, accolades, and now the coveted promotion on everyone's lips. Darren had charisma. Darren had charm. Darren had the favoritism that came naturally to people who knew how to play the game. But Michael had a plan. And this wasn't just about getting a title on a nameplate. This was about justice, strategy, and finally showing everyone that brains sometimes outplay bravado. He had spent weeks quietly observing who spoke up too often, who cut corners, which projects were actually successful versus which were smoke and mirrors. The puzzle was coming together, piece by piece, and today, the game would begin. The elevator dinged, announcing the arrival of the top management team, including the VP who would decide the promotion. The office seemed to shrink, every desk a front line in this quiet battlefield. Michael felt a thrill he hadn't felt in years, half fear, half excitement. No one suspected that the quiet guy who always kept his head down was about to turn the office hierarchy upside down. Everyone thought the promotion was Darren's for the taking. Everyone was wrong, because he had a secret advantage, one that would outsmart, outmaneuver, intimately rewrite the rules of the office game forever. The office smelled faintly of coffee and ambition, a mix that Michael had grown strangely fond of. Today wasn't just another day at the firm. Today the game began. Else, the promotion he had been eyeing for months was finally within reach, but the battlefield was treacherous. Michael walked past the rows of cubicles, each one buzzing with whispers. Some employees smiled nervously at him. Others glanced at Darren with admiration or fear. Darren, the self-proclaimed king of office politics, sat at his corner desk, organizing his papers like a general preparing for war. His aura was effortless confidence, polished shoes, and a charm that hid cunning behind every handshake. Michael's desk was unassuming, tucked away near the back, but from here, he could see everything. He had spent weeks noting patterns. When Darren got sloppy, when the boss was distracted, which coworkers were easily manipulated. Today, he would use this knowledge like a chess master setting traps. His first move, control the narrative. As the VP walked in, greeting everyone with that rare combination of scrutiny and favor, Michael made sure he was already visible, smiling politely, nodding at colleagues, appearing approachable yet competent. He knew appearances mattered as much as skill. Darren, of course, noticed him. That fleeting glance of recognition, half curiosity, half threat passed between them. Michael didn't flinch. He never flinched. He had a secret advantage that Darren couldn't see, couldn't predict, and definitely couldn't counter. The morning passed in a tense blur of emails, meetings, and whispered strategies. Michael carefully injected subtle suggestions into discussions, planting ideas that would later make him look brilliant. He guided conversations, nudged colleagues to reveal small weaknesses in their work, and always stayed just out of Darren's reach, watching, calculating. By noon, the office was a powder keg of ambition. Darren strutted to the break room, speaking loudly about his plans. Unaware that Michael had already discreetly positioned himself to make Darren look careless without seeming manipulative. Every glance, every word, every movement was deliberate, a silent dance of office warfare. As the chapter closed, Michael leaned back in his chair for a moment, sipping his coffee. The first phase of his plan was complete: observation and preparation. Darren thought he was untouchable, but Michael knew the real game was only beginning. And by the end of this week, the office would see a side of him no one expected. By mid-afternoon, the office had settled into its usual rhythm, or at least it seemed so. Michael knew better. Every laugh, every casual comment, every innocent suggestion from Darren was part of a performance, and Michael was ready to rewrite the script. His first move was subtle but effective, a small suggestion in a meeting that shifted the spotlight. The VP had called a brainstorming session to review a major project. Darren, confident as ever, jumped in immediately, outlining what he thought was a brilliant strategy. Everyone nodded politely, but Michael noticed flaws that Darren didn't. Tiny gaps in logic, assumptions that could backfire, steps that were impossible without extra resources. Michael waited, didn't interrupt. He let Darren speak, watching carefully how the VP reacted. Then, just at the right moment, he leaned forward and asked a calm, pointed question. Have we considered the risk if the client changes the timeline unexpectedly? How would this plan hold up? The room paused. Eyes shifted. The VP frowned slightly, intrigued. Darren's confident smile faltered for the first time that day. Michael didn't need to say more. He had planted a seed of doubt that made Darren's plan look less airtight, less polished. Next, he leveraged colleague dynamics. Michael had spent days subtly building rapport with key team members, those whose opinions mattered most. He casually praised their contributions, nudged conversations to highlight their successes, and gently suggested small improvements that would reflect well on the team. By the end of the day, people were beginning to see him not just as competent, but as someone who could lead without threatening anyone. Darren, meanwhile, had begun to sense something was off. Michael wasn't making a move that was obvious, yet there was a quiet shift in the office energy. His rival had underestimated the power of subtlety. He tried to reassert dominance with a showy presentation to the VP later in the afternoon. But Michael had already planted evidence that made Darren's numbers look slightly inconsistent. Nothing blatant, just enough to raise questions. By the time the clock ticked toward evening, Michael leaned back in his chair, watching Darren fume silently across the room. The first moves were complete. No one had noticed Michael weaving the web, but the threads were in place. Tomorrow, the real game would begin, the subtle undermining, the quiet maneuvers that would make Darren slip without anyone realizing it. And Michael would be ready, always one step ahead. The next morning, the office felt different. There was a faint tension in the air, like a storm about to break. Michael arrived early, coffee in hand, scanning the room like a general surveying the battlefield. Darren, on the other hand, seemed restless, his usual confidence now edged with unease. Michael's first success came almost immediately. A critical client report had been circulated the previous day, and Darren, in his usual rush to impress, had overlooked a small but important detail. Nothing catastrophic, but enough for an observant eye to notice. Michael quietly flagged it during a casual conversation with the VP, framing it as a concern for the project's success rather than a personal jab. The VP's eyebrows raised slightly. Darren's jaw tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. No one else noticed, but Michael did. It was the first visible crack in Darren's armor. Michael didn't stop there. I subtly reinforced his own image as reliable and detail-oriented. He volunteered for a small but high-visibility task, completing it flawlessly while Darren fumbled through a minor technical issue. Whispers began to circulate among the team. Michael really knows his stuff. Meanwhile, Darren tried to regain control. He threw himself into meetings, made flashy presentations, and attempted to charm the VP again. Michael had already created a quiet ripple of doubt. Darren's exaggerated efforts now appeared forced, almost desperate. By midday, Michael executed another move, a quiet alliance, with one of Darren's key supporters. Through casual conversations and shared insights, he subtly won them over, ensuring that Darren would lose not just credibility but influence over his own allies. The tension was almost tangible. Darren, sensing the shift but unable to pinpoint its cause, grew frustrated. Every attempt to regain dominance was met with calm competence from Michael, who seemed to glide effortlessly through every challenge, every task, every conversation. By evening, the office was buzzing quietly, not with the usual chatter of casual work, but with whispers of Michael's growing presence. Darren stared out the window, fists clenched. Realizing that the promotion he had assumed was his was no longer guaranteed, and he smiled to himself. The first wave of his plan had succeeded. The cracks were forming, and soon Darren would be vulnerable in ways he never imagined. By midweek, the office had transformed into a subtle battlefield. Every glance, every comment, every email felt like a move in an invisible game of chess. Michael had observed, prepared, and carefully maneuvered. But now, it was time for the masterstroke, the move that would tip the balance irreversibly in his favor. It began during a high-profile client meeting. Darren had been chosen to present the quarterly strategy, a golden opportunity to impress the VP and secure the promotion. Confident as ever, he strutted into the room, flawless suit, rehearsed smile, prepared to dominate. But Michael had already anticipated every step. Weeks of quiet preparation had allowed him to gather subtle yet undeniable evidence that highlighted Darren's repeated oversights. Nothing overt, nothing anyone could accuse him of directly, but enough to create doubt without confrontation. Michael positioned himself strategically in the back of the conference room, projecting calm authority. As Darren launched into his presentation, Michael gently asked a question that seemed innocent on the surface, but exposed a minor flaw in Darren's plan. "Darren, have we accounted for the recent client feedback on last quarter's implementation? How would our strategy adapt if those changes were implemented next month?" The room fell silent. Darren faltered, fumbling slightly as the VP leaned forward, interest piqued. Michael didn't intervene further. He let Darren struggle, subtle enough to not seem like sabotage, yet impactful enough that the cracks widened before everyone's eyes. Then came the second phase of the masterstroke. Michael had prepared a small visual report that highlighted the team's recent successes, carefully giving credit to colleagues while positioning himself as the strategic mind behind each accomplishment. He presented it effortlessly, his tone confident but unassuming. The VP's eyes lingered on him. Whispers among colleagues began. "Wow, Michael really organized this. I didn't realize he was leading that project." Darren's flashy charisma suddenly looked hollow in comparison. By the end of the meeting, Darren was no longer the uncontested star. Michael had subtly stolen the spotlight, making it appear natural, almost accidental. His influence was undeniable, and the office had begun to shift its attention toward him. As the day ended, Michael leaned back at his desk, satisfaction curling like fire in his chest. The masterstroke had landed. Darren was rattled, the VP intrigued, and the promotion. It was starting to feel within reach. But Michael knew the game wasn't over. One wrong move now could undo everything. The final chapters of this office heist were about to unfold, and the stakes had never been higher. The morning after the masterstroke, the office felt charged with a quiet tension. Everyone sensed the shift, even if they couldn't explain it. Darren walked in like a man plotting a counterattack, his usual confidence replaced by a thin veneer of control. He knew Michael had stolen the spotlight yesterday. He knew that the VP had started noticing someone other than him. And, worst of all, he didn't know exactly how Michael had done it. Darren's strategy was simple: overwhelm, intimidate, and reassert dominance. He launched into aggressive meetings, interrupted colleagues, and flaunted his past achievements at every opportunity. Emails turned into subtle digs, casual comments became pointed criticisms, and the office began to feel the strain of his rising tension. Michael, however, anticipated this. He had spent weeks mapping not just the office workflow, but Darren's patterns, his weaknesses, and his ego. He remained calm, never reacting, allowing Darren to reveal his desperation piece by piece. In a critical team meeting, Darren tried to discredit one of Michael's recent contributions, claiming a minor mistake in his report. But Michael had already prepared evidence to clarify and subtly correct the situation, making Darren look hasty and uninformed. The VP noticed. Colleagues began exchanging glances, realizing Darren's behavior was less about leadership and more about panic. Michael then executed a subtle but devastating maneuver. He offered a solution that solved a lingering problem Darren had failed to address, crediting the team, but not himself explicitly. The VP nodded appreciatively. Darren's frustrated glare met Michael's calm smile. The message was clear: competence beats aggression. By mid-afternoon, Darren's counterattacks were collapsing under their own weight. His attempts to manipulate colleagues backfired, leaving him isolated in subtle but obvious ways. Meanwhile, Michael's careful alliances remained strong, his influence expanding quietly yet powerfully. As the day ended, Michael leaned back in his chair, watching Darren storm out of the office in frustration. The rival who had seemed untouchable was now faltering, trapped in the web Michael had spun weeks ago. The promotion was no longer just a possibility, was starting to feel inevitable. Yet Michael knew the final moves would require even greater subtlety and daring. One wrong step now could undo all he had built. Tomorrow, the final chapters of this office heist would play out and only one would come out on top. The office was quieter than usual that morning, but the silence was deceptive. Everyone could feel that something monumental was about to unfold. Michael arrived early, as always. But today, his calm demeanor carried a new weight. He wasn't just playing the game anymore. He was about to win it outright. Darren, on the other hand, looked exhausted and jittery. His frantic attempts to reclaim control had left him overexposed. He had burned bridges with minor allies and shown cracks in front of the VP that Michael had meticulously documented in subtle ways. The office hierarchy was tilting, and Darren didn't even realize it. Michael's strategy for the day was surgical: orchestrate the final impression without appearing manipulative. Every action, every word, every email was carefully crafted to highlight his competence while letting Darren's mistakes speak for themselves. First, he organized a quick review session for a critical client project. Darren was expected to lead, but Michael subtly took control by summarizing key points, clarifying overlooked details, and proposing solutions that no one else had considered. He credited the team strategically, making it clear that he was both a leader and a collaborator. The VP was watching closely. Every nod, every appreciative glance, every subtle acknowledgement fell squarely in Michael's favor. Darren tried to interject, to assert dominance, but the more he spoke, the more obvious his panic and overcompensation became. His charm was gone, replaced by desperation. During lunch, he casually shared a brief success story from a recent project with select colleagues. Nothing flashy, it's just a quiet demonstration of foresight and leadership. By the time the VP walked past, whispers of admiration were already in the air. By mid-afternoon, the pieces were in place. Colleagues respected Michael, allies were loyal, and Darren was cornered by his own errors. The office had shifted without a single dramatic confrontation, without public humiliation. Michael had quietly positioned himself as the obvious choice for the promotion. As Michael leaned back at his desk, watching Darren fume quietly in the corner, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The final setup was complete. The victory was within reach, and tomorrow, the office would witness the culmination of weeks of strategy, observation, and precision. Tomorrow, the promotion and the ultimate triumph would be decided. The day had arrived. The VP called for the final review meeting, the moment every employee had been waiting for. Darren followed, suit impeccably pressed, smile forced, carrying the weight of mounting missteps. The VP began the meeting with a nod to the team's accomplishments over the past months. Then came the moment of truth, the promotion. Michael had prepared meticulously. Every project, every contribution, every subtle improvement he had executed over weeks now, came together in perfect clarity. Without boasting, he spoke confidently, answering questions precisely, and presenting his vision for the team's future. Darren tried to interject, throwing in flashy statistics and rehearsed phrases, but his words fell flat. Michael had already anticipated every argument, every challenge, and the VP noticed the difference. Then came the decisive moment. The VP looked around the room, pausing, letting the silence emphasize the choice before making it. "We believe you are the right choice for this promotion." The room erupted in quiet applause. No one cheered for Darren, not out of cruelty, but because his overconfidence had already undermined his credibility. Seeing him as someone who not only understood the work but mastered the politics without playing dirty, Darren slumped into his chair, realizing that his attempts to dominate, intimidate, and outshine had only hastened his downfall. As Michael packed up his belongings to move to his new office, he allowed himself a private smile. This wasn't just a promotion, it was the triumph of patience, intelligence, and subtle strategy. He had outsmarted a rival who thought charisma alone could win. Darren, meanwhile, would have to rethink how he approached ambition, realizing that overconfidence can be a liability. In the end, Michael didn't just win a title, he earned respect, its influence, and the quiet satisfaction of a perfectly executed plan. The office battlefield had been conquered, and Michael walked away knowing that strategy, patience, and observation were far more powerful than raw bravado.